Grace Johnson was a faithful wife, but at midnight, in the middle of a freezing storm, her husband Marcus decided a friend's lie was worth more than his marriage. He didn't care about the rain, and he certainly didn't care about the 7-month-old life growing inside her. He locked the gate and left her with nothing but the clothes on her back. For months, Grace survived in the hollow shell of an uncompleted building, eating the cold leftovers of the rich. She took a job as a cleaner at the Crown, the city's most elite restaurant, hiding her pregnancy behind a gray cardigan and a bowed head. But tonight, the balance of power is about to shift. Min-ho Lee, a man whose name makes the city tremble, has just walked in. He's about to witness a cruelty he cannot ignore, and Grace is about to find out that when a husband fails to protect, a mafia boss is ready to take over. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today we're diving into a story that proves the people who are supposed to protect us can sometimes be our biggest villains, and the person who saves us might be the one we least expect. We're talking about Grace, a woman whose life changed at the stroke of midnight. If you believe that karma always finds its way home, make sure you're subscribed. And before we start, tell us, where are you watching from today? Are you in the US, South Africa, or maybe London? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Now let's dive into the story. The sky over the suburbs was a bruised, heavy purple, bloated with a storm that had been threatening to break since sundown. Inside the small, tidy house on Willow Lane, the air was even more suffocating. Grace Johnson stood in the center of the living room, her hands instinctively cradling the prominent swell of her 7-month pregnancy. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Across from her stood Marcus, the man who had promised to cherish her until his last breath, but whose eyes now held nothing but a cold, jagged edge of hatred. "Marcus, please, just listen to me for 1 second," Grace pleaded, her voice trembling. "I don't know what they told you, but it's a lie. I have been home every night. I have been preparing for our son. How can you believe them over me?" Marcus didn't move. He stood by the front door, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of a large, bulging suitcase. "My friends don't lie to me, Grace. They saw you. They saw the way you were looking at him at the pharmacy. They heard the rumors. And now that I'm looking at you, really looking at you, I don't even see my own reflection in that belly anymore." The words felt like a physical blow to Grace's chest. The rumors were whispers from Marcus's childhood friends, men who had always resented Grace for tamming the life of the party, men who spent their nights in bars while she spent hers decorating a nursery. They had fed Marcus a poison of suspicion, and he had swallowed every drop. "It's your son, Marcus. We saw the ultrasound together. We picked out the name Michael together." Tears finally spilled over, hot and stinging against her dark brown skin. She moved toward him, reaching out a hand, but he recoiled as if her touch were toxic. "Don't touch me," he hissed. The storm outside finally broke, a sudden, violent crack of thunder shaking the floorboards followed by the roar of torrential rain. "I'm not being a fool for 1 more minute. I worked too hard for this house to let a woman like you occupy it while carrying another man's mistake." He turned and grabbed a second bag, a smaller duffel she had packed weeks ago with baby clothes. With a sudden, violent heave, he threw open the front door. The wind whipped into the house, bringing with it a spray of icy rain that soaked the carpet instantly. "Marcus, it's midnight, it's pouring." Grace's voice rose to a scream of disbelief. "Where am I supposed to go? Look at me." "Go to him," Marcus shouted over the thunder, his face contorted in a mask of disgust. "Go to whoever gave you that child." He grabbed the large suitcase and stepped out onto the porch. With a grunt of effort, he hurled it down the stairs. It tumbled once, twice, and burst open on the wet pavement of the driveway, her maternity dresses and the gray cardigan she loved so much spilling out into the muddy puddles. He followed with the duffel bag, throwing it into the darkness of the yard. Grace rushed to the threshold, the cold wind whipping her natural hair into her face. She fell to her knees at the doorway, her black maternity dress soaking up the moisture from the floor. "Marcus, I'm begging you. Think about the baby. It's freezing out there." He looked down at her, and for a fleeting second, Grace looked for a glimmer of the man who had proposed to her on a beach 3 years ago. She looked for the man who used to rub her feet and talk to her belly at night. But that man was gone, replaced by a stranger blinded by pride and the poisonous whispers of others. "Get out, Grace," he said, his voice terrifyingly quiet now. When she didn't move, Paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the moment, he reached down and grabbed her upper arm. He pulled her up and out onto the porch. Grace stumbled, her wet feet slipping on the wood. He didn't let her fall, but he didn't hold her gently either. He marched her to the edge of the stairs and let go. "Wait," she gasped, but the door was already swinging shut. The sound of the heavy deadbolt clicking into place was louder than the thunder. Grace stood on the porch, the rain drenching her in seconds, turning her thin cardigan into a heavy, freezing weight. She hammered on the wood until her fists were bruised. She called his name until her throat was raw and her voice was a mere whisper lost in the gale. "Marcus, please, I have nowhere to go." The house remained dark. Not a single light flickered. He had truly discarded her. Grace turned toward the driveway, her vision blurred by tears and the lashing rain. She saw her belongings scattered in the dirt. The bright yellow onesies she had bought just yesterday now stained with mud, her ultrasound photos likely dissolving in the bottom of the burst suitcase. She waddled down the stairs, every movement a struggle with the weight of the baby and the slickness of the ground. She knelt in the mud, trying to shove her soaked clothes back into the bag with shaking hands. The cold was beginning to settle into her bones, a deep, aching chill that made her teeth chatter uncontrollably. She looked up at the street. It was empty. The neighbors' lights were off. She was a black woman, 7 months pregnant, standing in the mud at midnight, labeled a traitor by the only person she had ever loved. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, her hand pressing firmly against her stomach as she felt a frantic kick from within. "It's just you and me now. I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." She managed to zip the broken suitcase halfway. Dragging the heavy, waterlogged mass behind her, she began to walk. She didn't have a car. Marcus had taken the keys. She didn't have a phone. He had smashed it on the kitchen counter an hour ago. All she had was the road ahead and the flickering hope that somewhere in this heartless night, there was a place where she wouldn't be a target of lies. As she disappeared into the shadows of the storm, leaving the only home she knew behind, Grace Johnson didn't know that miles away. In a penthouse that touched the clouds, a man named Minho Lee was looking out at the same rain, unaware that the woman who would change his life was currently walking toward her darkest hour. Grace stumbled, her cardigan snagging on a low-hanging branch as she left the neighborhood. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she looked back, she might lose the will to take the next step, and for the child heartbeat against her own, she had to keep moving, even if it was into the ruins of the city, even if it was into the unknown. The storm did not let up as Grace dragged her waterlogged suitcase through the outskirts of the city. Every step was a battle against the weight of her body and the treacherous, slick pavement. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, coming out as white mist in the freezing midnight air. The streetlights flickered and died out as she moved further away from the manicured suburbs and into a district where the pavement was cracked and the shadows grew long and jagged. By the time the clock struck 3, the adrenaline that had fueled her departure began to evaporate, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to collapse her lungs. Her feet were numb, her back was a knot of white-hot pain, and her damp cardigan felt like a shroud of ice against her skin. She stopped at the edge of a construction site that had clearly been abandoned for months. A skeleton of a building rose up against the dark sky, 4 stories of raw concrete, exposed rebar, and empty window sockets that looked like hollow eyes. With no other choice and the rain turning into a biting sleet, Grace hauled her broken suitcase over a low, rusted perimeter fence. She found a corner on the ground floor, tucked behind a thick concrete pillar that offered a meager shield against the wind. The floor was a bed of gray dust and gravel, but to Grace, it was a sanctuary. She collapsed onto her knees, her hands shaking so violently she could barely unzip her bag. She pulled out a handful of soaked baby clothes, tiny shirts and socks she had washed with such love just days ago, and laid them out on a dry patch of concrete, though she knew they wouldn't dry in this damp tomb. Finally, she found her thickest sweater, still slightly dry in the center of the bag, and wrapped it tightly around her protruding belly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into the darkness, her voice cracking as she leaned her head against the cold stone pillar. "I'm so sorry you have to be here, little one." She felt a slow, rhythmic movement from within, not the frantic kicks of earlier, but a steady nudge, as if the baby were trying to comfort her. The realization hit her then with the force of a tidal wave. She was completely alone. There was no Marcus to call, no mother to run to, and no friends who hadn't already turned their backs on her. She was a ghost in her own city. The cold began to seep upward from the concrete, biting through her dress. To stay warm, she began to arrange her wet clothes into a makeshift nest, layering them to create a barrier between her body and the frozen floor. She curled onto her side, her knees tucked toward her chest as much as her pregnancy would allow, clutching the gray cardigan to her neck. Sleep was impossible, but a heavy, feverish trance took over. In the silence of the concrete shell, every sound was magnified: the drip of rainwater from the floor above, the distant howl of a siren, the scuttle of a stray cat in the debris. She closed her eyes and pictured the nursery she had painted a soft, sky blue. She thought of the crib Marcus had assembled just last week, the same hands that had built it being the ones that threw her into the mud. He was wrong, she muttered, her jaw set in a sudden, fierce line. He was so wrong. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the empty window frames, the rain finally subsided into a miserable drizzle. Grace sat up, her joints popping with a sound like dry twigs snapping. She was covered in gray dust, her hair was matted with dried rainwater, and her eyes were rimmed with red. But as she looked down at her hands, she saw they had stopped shaking. She reached into the bottom of her bag and found a small, crumpled ultrasound photo that had somehow survived the night. The image was blurred, but the shape of a spine and a tiny head were visible. She pressed the photo to her lips, then tucked it safely into the pocket of her cardigan, right against her heart. "They want us to disappear," she whispered to the empty, gray room. "They want us to give up and fade away so they don't have to look at the truth, but we aren't going anywhere." She stood up slowly, using the concrete pillar for support, her muscles screaming in protest. She looked out at the city skyline, where the sun was struggling to pierce through the heavy clouds. Somewhere out there was a way to survive. She didn't need a house with a white picket fence or a husband who listened to the whispers of cowards. She only needed a foothold. "I promise you," she said, her voice gaining a newfound strength that echoed off the raw concrete walls. "You will not be born in the dark. You will not be born in the cold. I will find a way. We are going to survive this, Michael. I will make sure of it." Grace Johnson began to pack her ruined belongings, not with the desperation of a victim, but with the methodical focus of a woman going to war. She would find work. She would find food. And one day, she would look back at this concrete shell not as her end, but as the place where she became unbreakable. Dragging her suitcase behind her, she stepped out of the shadows and back into the world, a queen in a tattered cardigan, ready to claim her life back. The transition from the cold, skeletal embrace of the unfinished building to the suffocating heat of the kitchen at the Crown was a journey between two different worlds. Every morning, before the sun had fully claimed the sky, Grace arrived at the service entrance of the city's most prestigious restaurant. She walked with a slow, rhythmic gait, her hand never far from the small of her back as she navigated the sharp, biting pain that came with 7.5 months of pregnancy and a floor made of concrete dust. The restaurant manager, a man whose kindness was as thin as his mustache but sufficient enough to keep him from asking questions, had hired her on the spot when she appeared at his door 3 weeks prior. He didn't ask for an ID, and she didn't ask for a fair wage. They both understood the unspoken contract of the desperate. She was the woman who cleaned the things no one else wanted to touch. She scrubbed the grout between the marble tiles until her knuckles bled, and she polished the brass railings until they reflected the indifferent faces of the city's elite. By mid-afternoon, the air in the kitchen became a thick soup of expensive spices, roasting meats, and the sharp tang of cleaning chemicals. Grace moved through the chaos like a shadow, her black maternity dress now faded to a dull charcoal, hidden beneath a stained white apron. She worked in the dish pit, a steaming cavern of industrial washers and jagged stacks of porcelain. Her task was to clear the plates that came back from the dining room, plates that carried more wealth in their porcelain curves than she had in her entire life. It was during the late-night shifts that the true test of her pride occurred. As the waiters in their crisp uniforms hurried past, tossing half-eaten delicacies onto the stainless steel counters, Grace's stomach would let out a low, hollow growl that felt like a physical ache. She would watch as prime rib, barely touched, was scraped toward the trash bin, and artisanal bread rolls were discarded because they had grown slightly cold. "Don't let that go to waste," she whispered to herself one evening, her eyes darting toward the security camera in the corner. When the kitchen staff took their smoke breaks, Grace found her moments. With practiced, silent movements, she would intercept a plate of truffle-infused pasta or a portion of roasted chicken before it hit the refuse pile. She didn't eat them there in the light. Instead, she had a small, plastic container hidden behind the industrial detergent buckets. She would carefully pack the remnants, a piece of steak here, a handful of asparagus there, and tuck the container into the deep pocket of her gray cardigan. This was her leftover feast. It was the fuel that kept Michael's heart beating. It was the salt and the protein that kept her legs from giving out while she scrubbed the floors of the billionaires. At the end of her 12-hour shift, Grace would walk back to the uncompleted building, the weight of the plastic container against her hip feeling like a treasure. The walk was longer now, her ankles swollen to twice their size, but the thought of the meal kept her moving. Back in her concrete sanctuary, lit only by a single battery-powered lantern she had found in a dumpster, Grace would sit in her nest of damp clothes and open the container. The food was cold. The flavors mingled together in a confusing mash of luxury and desperation, but she ate with a focus that was almost holy. She chewed slowly, savoring the nutrients, picturing them traveling through her blood to the tiny life that was now her entire universe. "Today we had duck, Michael," she would whisper into the dark, her voice raspy from the cleaning fumes. "And something called saffron. It's expensive. It means we're going to be strong. You're going to have the best of everything, even if I have to steal it from their trash." One night, as she sat eating a piece of artisan sourdough, a tear escaped and fell onto the bread. It wasn't a tear of sadness. She had cried all those out on the night Marcus threw her out. It was a tear of pure, iron-willed resolve. She looked at her hands, wrinkled and white from the dishwater, and then at her belly, which was hard and round beneath the cardigan. She was no longer the woman who pleaded for Marcus to believe her. She was a provider. She was a survivor. Every scrap of food she scavenged was a victory against the man who thought she would wither away and die without him. The Crown saw her as a ghost, a nameless cleaner who vanished into the night, but Grace knew she was a warrior preparing for a reckoning. As she finished the last of her scavenged meal and curled up on the cold floor, she felt a strong, deliberate kick. It was a promise. They were still here. They were still fighting. And the city that looked down on her had no idea what was coming. The evening air inside the Crown was thick with the scent of expensive jasmine and the hushed, rhythmic clinking of silver against fine bone china. Grace was positioned near the heavy velvet curtains that separated the dining hall from the service corridor, her hands gripping a spray bottle and a microfiber cloth. Her back ached with a dull, throbbing persistence, and beneath her gray cardigan, she could feel the heat of her own skin, a feverish byproduct of a day spent scrubbing the industrial walk-in freezers. She kept her head down, a ghost in a black maternity dress, waiting for the high society rush to lull so she could begin the nightly task of buffing the marble baseboards. Suddenly, the ambient hum of the restaurant, the laughter of CEOs and the soft jazz from the overhead speakers, stuttered and died. The revolving glass doors at the entrance slowed, and a cold, sharp stillness swept into the room, more piercing than the midnight storm that had cast Grace out weeks ago. The manager, a man who usually moved with a frantic, self-important bustle, seemed to shrink. He stood at the maitre d' stand, his hands trembling as he straightened his bow tie. The waiters stopped in their tracks, trays held tight to their chests, their eyes darting toward the entryway with a mixture of reverence and primal fear. Min-Ho Lee walked in first. He was a man carved from shadow and obsidian. His black suit was tailored with such lethal precision that it seemed to absorb the ambient light of the crystal chandeliers. He didn't walk so much as he reclaimed the space around him, each step measured and heavy with an invisible authority. His hair was slicked back, revealing a face that was a study in controlled intensity, high cheekbones, a jawline like a blade, and eyes that moved over the room not with curiosity, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a predator who already owned the forest. This was the man the tabloids whispered about, the power behind the city's most silent and deadly empires. But beside him, clinging to his arm like a decorative but jagged piece of glass, was his wife, Chloe. If Min-Ho was the storm, Chloe was the lightning, brief, bright, and destructive. She was draped in silk the color of dried blood, her neck adorned with diamonds that looked heavy enough to choke a lesser woman. Her face was a mask of porcelain perfection, but her lips were curled in a permanent sneer of boredom and disdain. She didn't look at the restaurant, she looked down at it. "The air in here is stagnant, Min-Ho," she remarked, her voice cutting through the silence like a whip. She pulled a silk handkerchief from her clutch and pressed it daintily to her nose. I told you we should have flown to Paris for dinner. This city is becoming dusty. The manager practically threw himself toward them. Mr. Lee, such an unexpected honor. Your table, the private alcove, is waiting. We've prepared the vintage krug as you requested. Minho didn't speak. He merely gave a slight, imperceptible nod, his eyes scanning the room one last time before landing briefly on the service corridor. For a split second, Grace felt his gaze pass over her. It wasn't the dismissive look she received from the other patrons. It was a heavy, piercing observation that made her heart skip a beat. She instinctively pulled her cardigan tighter over her belly, retreating further into the shadows of the velvet curtains. Make sure the help stays out of my sight, Chloe snapped, her eyes landing on a waiter who had moved slightly too close. I find it impossible to digest when I'm surrounded by people who smell of labor. As the couple began their procession toward the private alcove, the restaurant slowly began to breathe again, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The lightheartedness was gone, replaced by a tense, electric vibration. Grace watched them move, the powerful man and the cruel woman. She felt a familiar pang of injustice in her chest, a memory of Marcus's voice calling her a mistake, but it was suppressed by the sheer, crushing presence of Minho Lee. She turned back to her work, kneeling painfully on the cold marble to scrub at a smudge she had missed. She was a cleaner, and they were the gods of the city. Their worlds were never meant to touch. She didn't know that the stillness brought by Minho Lee wasn't just fear, it was the quiet before a revolution. She didn't know that within the hour, the dust, Chloe so despised, would become the only thing Minho Lee cared to protect, and the silk-clad woman at his side would find herself discarded in a way Grace knew all too well. Grace dipped her cloth into the bucket, her reflection in the shiny floor looking tired and small. Above her, the elite continued their feast, unaware that the most powerful man in the room was already losing his appetite for the life he had built, and gaining one for the truth hidden in the shadows. The shift in the room was subtle at first, a ripple of unease that traveled from the kitchen doors to the most expensive booths. Grace was working near the perimeter of the private alcove, her movements mechanical and weary. The bucket of gray, soapy water felt heavier than usual, and her lower back pulsed with a sharp, rhythmic heat that made every dip of her cloth an exercise in willpower. She didn't look up as the elite whispered, but she could feel the presence of Minho Lee like a cold front pressing against her skin. He sat in the center of the alcove, a silent titan, barely touching his wine while Chloe, draped in her blood-red silk, toyed with a pearl necklace that likely cost more than the house Grace had been kicked out of. Chloe was restless. Her boredom was a tangible thing, a sharp-edged weapon looking for a target. The service here has become sluggish, Minho, Chloe sighed, her voice loud enough to make a nearby waiter flinch. It feels heavy, low class. Grace kept her head down, moving her rag across the marble baseboard. She was 5 feet away, a shadow in a cardigan. She needed to finish this corner and retreat to the dish pit before her legs gave out. But as she moved to shift her bucket, her swollen ankle buckled slightly. The bucket tipped. It didn't fall, but a wave of gray, dirty water splashed over the rim, fanning out across the pristine floor and soaking the hem of Chloe's silk gown and the toe of her designer heels. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a guillotine blade suspended in midair. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I am so sorry, ma'am. It was an accident. I'll clean it immediately. She scrambled to her knees, her belly making the movement awkward and painful, her microfiber cloth already working frantically to soak up the water. But Chloe was already standing. Her face wasn't just angry, it was transformed by a hideous, gleaming delight. She finally had something to vent her malice upon. You filthy, clumsy creature, Chloe hissed. Her voice carried to every corner of the silent restaurant. Do you have any idea what this dress costs? Do you have any idea who you just touched with your filth? Grace didn't look up, her heart hammering against her ribs. I'm sorry, ma'am. Please, it was a slip. A slip? You're an eyesore, Chloe spat. Before anyone could breathe, Chloe leaned down and delivered a sharp, stinging slap across Grace's face. The sound cracked through the dining room like a gunshot. Grace's head snapped to the side, her natural hair falling over her face as she slumped further toward the floor. The restaurant gasped as one, a collective intake of breath that held no pity, only shock at the breach of decorum. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Chloe screamed. She grabbed the bucket Grace had been using, the water dark with the soot of the restaurant floors, and with a violent heave, she threw the contents over Grace's head. The cold, dirty water drenched Grace instantly. It soaked through her gray cardigan, weighed down her black maternity dress, and ran in muddy streaks down her dark brown skin. Grace sat in the middle of the floor, shivering, her hands instinctively shielding her stomach, her eyes wide and brimming with tears that refused to fall in front of these monsters. Chloe turned to the manager, who was white-faced and trembling. "Sack her, now, and ensure she leaves with nothing. This place is a pigsty if you allow pregnant strays to roam the floors." Throughout the entire ordeal, Min-ho Lee had not moved. He sat perfectly still, his glass of wine halfway to his lips. But as Grace finally looked up, her eyes met his. In that look, Min-ho didn't see a clumsy servant. He saw the way she shielded her belly, a gesture of fierce, maternal protection he had seen in the women of his own bloodline. He saw the exhaustion in her face. The evidence of a woman who had been pushed to the edge of the world and refused to jump. But most of all, he saw the false claim. He saw the eyes of a woman who had been lied about, discarded, and humiliated, yet still carried a spark of silent, unbreakable dignity. He saw the echoes of every betrayal he had ever navigated in the underworld, and he recognized the truth in her. Min-ho slowly set his glass down. The clink of the crystal against the table sounded like a death knell. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at Grace, his dark eyes narrowing as he took in the wet cardigan and the bruised cheek. "Min-ho, darling, tell them," Chloe said, her voice turning sweet and poisonous as she reached for his arm. "Tell them to throw her out into the street where she belongs." Min-ho Lee stood up. He was a head taller than everyone else, a dark pillar of absolute authority. He reached out and brushed Chloe's hand off his sleeve as if it were an insect. He didn't look at his wife, he looked at the manager. "Is there a private room in the back?" Min-ho asked. His voice was a low, vibrating growl that made the manager's knees buckle. "Why, yes, Mr. Lee, the office." "Take her there," Min-ho commanded, gesturing toward Grace. "Bring towels, bring a doctor, and bring a chair that is comfortable enough for a queen." Chloe's jaw dropped. "Min-ho, what are you doing? She ruined my dress. She's a nobody." Min-ho finally turned his gaze to his wife. It was a look so cold, so devoid of affection, that Chloe actually took a step back. "You have spent 5 years ruining my name with your cruelty, Chloe. You have mistaken my silence for agreement." He leaned in closer, his voice a lethal whisper. "But you just struck a woman who has more strength in her pinky finger than you have in your entire bloodline." He turned back to the room, his voice rising so that every elite diner heard him. "Dinner is over. The Crown is closed for the night. I suggest you all leave before I lose my patience." As the panicked diners scrambled for their coats, Min-ho stepped toward Grace. He didn't care about the dirty water on the floor or the soot on her cardigan. He reached down and offered a hand that ruled the city's shadows, to the woman the world had tried to erase. Grace looked at his hand, then up at his face. She saw no pity there. She saw recognition. She saw a protector. For the first time since midnight on that rainy porch, Grace felt the ice in her heart begin to thaw. She reached out and took his hand, and as he pulled her up, the false claim that had haunted her began to wither. The Mafia boss had seen the truth, and the world was about to find out exactly what happened when Min-ho Lee decided to claim what was broken. The silence that followed Min-ho Lee's declaration was not merely a lack of noise. It was a vacuum, an atmospheric shift that made the very air in the restaurant feel thin and electric. Chloe stood frozen, her hand still raised from the violence she had just committed, her face a mask of painted-on perfection that was rapidly cracking. The diamonds at her throat caught the light of the chandeliers, mocking the darkness that was settling behind her husband's eyes. Min-ho did not look at the diners who were scrambling to settle their checks and vanish into the night. He did not look at the manager, who was currently ushering a shivering Grace toward the back office with the kind of frantic care one might give to a piece of ancient, fragile glass. Instead, Min-ho reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. "Min-ho, stop this at once," Chloe hissed, her voice low and sharp, vibrating with a desperate attempt to regain control. "You are making a spectacle, over a servant, Over a girl who smells like a sewer. Think of our image. Think of the board. Minho ignored her. He tapped a single contact on his screen and held the phone to his ear. His gaze remained fixed on the spot on the floor where Grace's dirty dishwater still pooled, a gray stain on his wife's pristine reputation. Junha, Minho said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. I am at the Crown. I need you here in 10 minutes. Bring the standard termination filing for a domestic partnership. Yes, the one we drafted 2 years ago. Chloe's breath hitched, a sharp, audible sound in the now empty dining room. 2 years ago. You've had papers ready for 2 years. Minho lowered the phone, his expression as unreadable as a stone wall. I have had them ready since the night you laughed while your driver hit that stray dog in Seoul, Chloe. I was simply waiting for the moment you finally proved that your soul was as hollow as your promises. Tonight, you didn't just hit a dog. You struck a mother. You struck a woman who has more honor in her silence than you have in your entire lineage. I am your wife, she shrieked, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. You were an arrangement, Minho corrected her, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. An arrangement that has reached its expiration date. True to his word, 10 minutes had not yet passed before a man in a sharp navy suit burst through the revolving doors. Junha, Minho's personal counsel and fixer, carried a leather briefcase with the practiced ease of a soldier. He didn't look at the chaos. He didn't look at the sobbing woman in red. He walked straight to Minho and placed a single, thick document on the table, right next to the glass of wine Minho had never finished. It's all here, sir, Junha said, clicking a gold pen and laying it across the top page. It covers the asset split as per the prenuptial agreement. She receives the villa in Jeju and the monthly stipend, provided she signs the non-disclosure and non-interference clauses immediately. Minho picked up the pen. With a few swift, jagged strokes, he signed his name. Then, he slid the paper across the white linen tablecloth toward Chloe. Sign it, Minho commanded. I won't, Chloe spat, her eyes wild. I'll fight you. I'll take half of everything. I'll tell the papers about your associates and your business trips to Macau. Minho stepped closer to her, his presence suddenly overwhelming, the cold scent of his cologne filling her lungs. You will sign it because if you don't, Junha will open the second folder in that briefcase. The one containing the bank records of the charity you've been using to funnel money to your lover in Milan. The one that proves you've been stealing from the Lee Foundation for 3 fiscal years. Chloe's face went from flushed red to a ghostly, sickly white. Her hand trembled as it reached for the gold pen. She looked around the restaurant, the place where she had spent years being the queen, and realized the staff were all looking away. Even the manager was gone. She was alone with a man she had never truly known, a man who was now looking at her with nothing but professional boredom. She signed the paper, the nib of the pen tearing through the expensive parchment in her haste. There, she choked out, throwing the pen at him. I hope she was worth it. I hope that pregnant trash is worth the scandal. She is a human being, Chloe, Minho said, picking up the signed document and handing it to Junha. Something you stopped being a long time ago. Now leave. My driver is waiting outside to take you to the airport. Your flight to Jeju leaves in 2 hours. If you are still in this city by dawn, the arrangements will become significantly less comfortable. Chloe grabbed her clutch, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm as she fled the restaurant, her red dress trailing through the dirty water she had forced Grace to clean. She didn't look back. Minho stood for a moment, adjusting his cuffs. The adrenaline of the moment didn't show on his face, but his pulse was steady and certain. He turned away from the door and walked toward the back office. When he pushed the door open, he saw Grace. She was sitting in the manager's oversized leather chair, wrapped in several clean, white tablecloths. A bowl of warm water sat on the desk, and she was gently dabbing at her bruised cheek. She looked up as he entered, her dark brown eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a budding, fragile hope. She's gone, Minho said simply. Grace looked at him, her hand moving to her belly. You didn't have to do that. I'm just the cleaner, I'm no one. Minho walked over and knelt beside the chair, a gesture that would have shocked the city if they had seen it. He looked at the wet, gray cardigan she still clutched around her shoulders. No one is just anything, Grace, he said, his voice softer than it had been all evening. In my world, we value two things: loyalty and the strength to survive. You have survived a storm that would have drowned most men. And as for being a cleaner, he reached out, hesitating for a second before gently touching the hem of the tablecloth wrapped around her. Tonight, you cleaned more than just the floors. You helped me clear a path I should have taken years ago. Grace's lip trembled. My husband, Marcus, he said I was a mistake. He said I was nothing. Marcus is a fool who traded a diamond for a handful of gravel, Minho replied, his eyes flashing with a brief, dark promise of future retribution. But you don't have to worry about Marcus anymore, and you don't have to worry about where you'll sleep tonight. He stood up and offered his hand again. My home has many rooms, Grace, and it is in desperate need of someone who knows the value of a foundation. Will you come with me? Grace looked at his hand, the hand of a man who had just destroyed his own marriage to protect a stranger. She thought of the uncompleted building, the cold concrete, and the leftovers she had eaten in the dark. Then she felt Michael move, a strong, confident kick against her ribs. She took his hand. Yes, she whispered, I'll come. As Minho led her out of the darkened restaurant and toward the waiting line of black sedans, the rain began to fall again. But this time, for Grace Johnson, the water didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a cleansing. The Mafia boss didn't just have a car waiting, he had a new life prepared. And for the first time in months, Grace didn't look at the ground. She looked at the horizon. The convoy of black sedans moved through the rain-slicked streets like a silent, predatory fleet, eventually turning off the main thoroughfare and ascending a private, winding road lined with ancient oaks. At the summit sat the Lee estate, a monolithic structure of glass, dark stone, and iron that seemed to command the very air around it. As the car came to a smooth halt beneath a grand portico, Minho did not wait for his security detail. He stepped out into the damp air and personally opened the door for Grace, offering a steadying hand as she navigated the transition from the leather interior to the polished granite of the driveway. The interior of the mansion was a stark contrast to the hollow, concrete shell Grace had called home for weeks. The air was warm and scented with sandalwood and fresh lilies, and the light from the recessed fixtures cast a soft, golden glow over a vast foyer filled with contemporary art and minimalist elegance. Grace felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness as her wet, gray cardigan dripped onto the white marble floor, the hem of her black maternity dress stained with the soot of the restaurant. Don't look at the floor, Grace, Minho said, his voice a low, reassuring vibration beside her. The house is just stone and glass. You are the only thing in it that matters tonight. He gestured to a woman standing near the base of a floating staircase, a stern but kind-faced woman in a crisp charcoal uniform. This is Mrs. Han. She has been with my family for 30 years. She will see to everything you need. Welcome home, Ms. Johnson, Mrs. Han said, her voice carrying a soft, maternal warmth that nearly broke the last of Grace's composure. If you will follow me, the medical team is already upstairs. Grace was led to a suite that felt larger than the entire house she had shared with Marcus. The walls were upholstered in silk, and a fire crackled in a hearth carved from a single block of obsidian. In the center of the room, two women in white medical tunics stood waiting. They were part of Minho's private staff, doctors who usually tended to the discreet needs of his organization, now repurposed for the most delicate mission of their careers. The next hour was a blur of sensory restoration. Grace was led into a bathroom that felt more like a sanctuary, where a deep soaking tub had been filled with water at a precise, therapeutic temperature. Mrs. Han assisted her with a tenderness Grace hadn't experienced since childhood, helping her peel away the wet, heavy layers of her discarded life. As the warmth of the water hit her skin, Grace let out a sob, not of pain, but of the sheer, overwhelming shock of being cared for. The grime of the construction site, the smell of industrial dish soap, and the chill of the midnight rain were washed away by oils that smelled of lavender and honey. Once she was dried and wrapped in a robe made of silk, so thick it felt like a protective weight, the medical team took over. They worked with quiet, professional efficiency, checking her vitals and performing a portable ultrasound with equipment that looked far more advanced than anything Grace had seen at the public clinic. The baby's heart rate is strong, Ms. Johnson, the lead doctor said, a small smile breaking her professional mask as the rhythmic thump-thump-thump filled the room. He's a fighter. He's slightly underweight, but with the nutrition plan we've prepared, he'll catch up in no time. You, however, are suffering from extreme exhaustion and mild dehydration. We've added a vitamin infusion to your IV. Grace lay back against the pillows of a bed that felt like a cloud, her hand resting on the cool gel on her stomach. For the first time in months, the tightness in her chest, the constant, gnawing fear of what if, began to unravel. As the doctors finished, a silver tray was brought in. It wasn't the cold, scavenged leftovers from a plastic container. It was a bowl of steaming abalone porridge, delicate poached salmon, and vibrant greens. Grace ate slowly, her hands no longer shaking. Each bite felt like a brick being laid in a new foundation. Minho appeared in the doorway just as she was finishing. He had changed into a soft cashmere sweater, his sharp, predatory edge softened by the domestic setting, though the authority still clung to him like a second skin. He stood at the foot of the bed, his dark eyes taking in the transformation, the way her dark brown skin now glowed in the firelight, and the way the tension had finally left her shoulders. "The doctors tell me Michael is doing well," he said, using the name she had whispered in the restaurant. "He is," Grace replied, her voice soft but steady. She looked around the room, then back at the man who had quite literally pulled her from the ashes. "Why are you doing this, Minho? You don't even know me. You've risked your reputation, your marriage, everything." Minho walked to the window, looking out at the dark expanse of his estate. "In my world, Grace, people believe that power is about what you can take. They think it's about who you can crush. But I have spent my life surrounded by people like Marcus and Chloe, people who use their status to hide their cowardice. When I saw you on that floor, protecting your child while a woman with every advantage in the world tried to break you, I saw real power. I saw something I haven't seen in a very long time." He turned back to her, his expression solemn. "I didn't do this for charity. I did it because I want that kind of strength in my house. I want a reason to look in the mirror and see someone other than a man who rules through fear." He walked over and placed a hand briefly over hers on the silk duvet. It was the touch of a protector, a silent vow that the doors of this mansion were now a barrier between her and every lie Marcus Johnson had ever told. "Sleep now, Grace," he whispered. "The medical team is in the next room. Mrs. Han is outside the door, and I am downstairs. You are safe. The world can wait until tomorrow." As Minho dimmed the lights and exited, Grace watched the shadows of the fire dance on the ceiling. She felt Michael kick, a strong, rhythmic thump that seemed to echo the beating heart of the house. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She wasn't a cleaner. She was a guest of the most powerful man in the city, and as she drifted into the first deep, dreamless sleep she had known in months, she knew that the false claim was finally dead. The rise of Grace Johnson had begun. The morning light filtered through the tall, arched windows of the breakfast nook, casting long, soft shadows across the table. Grace sat enveloped in a robe of cream-colored cashmere, her dark brown skin glowing with a health that had been absent for months. Before her sat a spread of fresh fruit, warm bread, and nutrient-rich juices, but her appetite was secondary to the presence of the man sitting across from her. Minho Lee was dressed in a simple black silk shirt, his sharp features relaxed as he scanned a set of documents, yet the air of coiled power never truly left him. "You look different today, Grace," Minho said, setting his papers aside. He poured a cup of tea with a steady hand, the steam rising between them like a veil. "The shadows under your eyes are finally beginning to fade." Grace looked down at her tea, her fingers tracing the delicate gold rim of the porcelain cup. "It's the first time I haven't woken up wondering if the rain would come through the roof," she whispered. She looked up, her gaze searching his. "But the silence is strange. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm waiting for someone to tell me I don't belong here." Minho's expression didn't flicker. "In this house, my word is the only one that matters, and I say you belong. But for you to truly be at peace, I need to understand the storm that drove you here. I know what my wife did, but I want to know about the man who failed you first. I want to know about Marcus Johnson." At the mention of the name, Grace's posture stiffened. The phantom chill of that midnight porch seemed to return for a fleeting second. She took a slow, grounding breath, her hand moving to the swell of her belly where Michael was quiet, as if listening. "Marcus wasn't always a monster," Grace began, her voice low and distant. "When we met, he was the man who promised me the world. We were building a life, but he was weak, Minho. He surrounded himself with men who peaked in high school, friends who saw my pregnancy not as a blessing, but as a leash that took their drinking buddy away. They started whispers, small things at first, lies about where I was during the day, who I was talking to at the market. Minho leaned back, his dark eyes narrowing. He was a man who lived and breathed in the world of information. He knew how easily a well-placed lie could topple an empire. They told him I was cheating, Grace continued, her voice gaining a hard, bitter edge. They told him the baby wasn't his, and because Marcus is a man who values the respect of fools more than the love of his wife, he believed them. He didn't ask for a test. He didn't look at my face. He just waited until the middle of a storm at midnight and threw me out like I was nothing but trash he'd forgotten to set on the curb. He smashed my phone so I couldn't call for help. He took my keys. He left me in the mud. Minho remained silent, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. His fingers tapped a slow, rhythmic beat against the mahogany table, a sign, to those who knew him, that he was calculating a debt. He called me a mistake, Grace whispered, her eyes brimming with the remnants of that old pain. He told me to go to whoever gave me the child. He chose a lie over his own flesh and blood because he was too proud to be seen as a fool by his friends. Minho stood up slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the sprawling estate. He stood with his back to her, his silhouette sharp against the morning sky. There are many types of sins in my world, Grace. I deal in violence, in secrets, and in power. But the one thing I cannot abide is a man who lacks the spine to protect what is his. A man who betrays the person carrying his legacy is not a man at all. He is a parasite. He turned back to her, his face a mask of cold, lethal clarity. He didn't just hurt you, Grace. He insulted the very idea of family. In my culture and in my business, that is a debt that must be settled with interest. I don't want more violence, Minho, Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. I just want to be safe. You are safe, Minho replied, stepping closer until he was standing directly beside her. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers before he settled it firmly on the table. But safety is not enough. Justice is the only thing that ensures the past stays in the past. Marcus Johnson thinks he has won. He thinks he has discarded a burden and kept his pride intact. He is currently living in the house you helped build, sleeping in the bed you chose, while you were eating scraps from my floor. Minho's eyes flashed with a dark, predatory light. I am a man of many flaws, Grace, but I have a very long memory for those who mistreat the vulnerable. Marcus has a debt of justice to pay to you and to the son he disowned. What are you going to do? Grace asked, her heart racing. Minho offered a small, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. I am going to remind him that every action has a consequence, and I am going to ensure that when he finally sees the truth, it will be from the very bottom of the hole he dug for you. He wanted to listen to his friends. Fine. He will find out exactly how much those friends are worth when my lawyers and my associates begin to dismantle his life piece by piece. He leaned down, his voice a low promise. He threw you out at midnight. I think it's only fair that he learns what it's like to have the world turn dark when he least expects it. You don't need to worry about the details, Grace. You only need to focus on Michael. Leave the garbage to the man who knows how to dispose of it. As Minho walked out of the room to make the calls that would begin Marcus's downfall, Grace sat in the silence of the sun-drenched nook. For the first time, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt the weight of a powerful hand on her shoulder, a hand that didn't just offer comfort, but a shield. The truth had emerged, and in the world of Minho Lee, the truth was a weapon. Marcus Johnson had no idea that the storm he had started at midnight was about to return to his doorstep. And this time, it was wearing a black suit and carrying the weight of a mafia boss's wrath. The air in the garden of the Lee estate was still, the afternoon heat tempered by the gentle spray of hidden fountains. Grace sat on a stone bench, her fingers tracing the delicate embroidery of a silk wrap Minho had gifted her. For the first time, she felt the baby, Michael, settle into a peaceful rhythm, his kicks no longer frantic. But the serenity of the afternoon was shattered when one of Minho's security detail approached, his face an unreadable mask of professional discipline. Ms. Johnson, the man said, bowing slightly. There is a man at the perimeter gate, a Marcus Johnson. He is demanding to speak with you. He says he has legal rights to the child. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. The old reflex of fear, the memory of the cold rain and the locking deadbolt, threatened to pull her under. But before she could speak, a shadow fell across the stone path. Minho was there, his tailored suit jacket discarded, His shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink of a dragon coiling around his forearm, a rare glimpse of the man beneath the billionaire's facade. "Let him in," Minho said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "Minho, no," Grace whispered, standing up unsteadily. "He's only here because he found out about you. He doesn't want me. He wants what he thinks he can get from you." "I know exactly what he wants, Grace," Minho replied, his dark eyes fixing on the gate. "And I want him to see exactly what he threw away." A few minutes later, Marcus Johnson was escorted up the winding driveway. He looked wildly out of place against the backdrop of ancient oaks and marble statues. He wore a cheap button-down shirt that was wrinkled at the collar, and his eyes darted around the estate with a hungry, desperate greed. When he saw Grace, his expression shifted instantly into a mask of feigned concern, though his gaze kept sliding past her to calculate the value of the mansion behind her. "Grace," Marcus called out, stepping forward until the security detail barred his path with a single, firm movement. "Grace, baby, I've been looking everywhere for you. I was so worried. Those friends of mine." "They lied, Grace. I found out they were just jealous of us. I was out of my mind with grief when I sent you away." Grace stood her ground, her hand resting firmly on her belly. "You weren't worried at midnight, Marcus. You weren't worried when you smashed my phone and threw my clothes into the mud. You only found me because you saw my face on a social media post at the Crown." Marcus's face hardened, the mask of the loving husband slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "Look, I'm the father of that kid. That counts for something. I've talked to a lawyer, Grace. If you want me to sign away my rights, if you want this friend of yours to have a clean slate, it's going to cost. A lot. I figure a guy who owns half the city can afford to pay for my pain and suffering." Minho stepped forward then, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a panther. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The very air seemed to grow heavy around him. "Pain and suffering?" Minho asked, his voice chillingly polite. "Tell me, Mr. Johnson, what is the current market rate for a woman's dignity? What is the price for a child left to sleep in a concrete ruin?" Marcus squared his shoulders, trying to match Minho's height, failing miserably. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'm the legal husband. You're just the guy hiding her. You give me $5 million and I disappear. If not, I go to the press. Billionaire kidnaps pregnant wife of local man. Think of the scandal." Minho let out a short, dark laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, translucent digital tablet, tapping a few commands. "I don't play by the rules of the press, Marcus," Minho said. "And I certainly don't pay for things I already own. You talk about legal rights? Let's talk about yours. As of 10 minutes ago, your mortgage, the one you've been behind on for 3 months, was purchased by one of my holding companies. Foreclosure starts at dawn." Marcus blinked, his mouth falling open. You can't do that." "I can do much more," Minho continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I've also looked into those friends of yours. It seems they've been using your basement to store certain, unregulated substances. I've already sent the tip and the security footage to the local precinct. They're likely knocking on your door right now." Marcus took a step back, his bravado crumbling into pure, unadulterated terror. "You're framing me. This is illegal." "No," Minho corrected, stepping into Marcus's personal space until the smaller man was forced to look up. "This is a debt. You threw a pregnant woman into a storm. Now I am the storm. You came here to extort money. You'll be lucky if you have a pair of shoes left by the end of the week. You have 60 seconds to leave this property before my security detail treats you like the trespasser you are." "Grace," Marcus yelled, looking at her with wide, pleading eyes. "Tell him to stop. We're family." Grace looked at the man she had once loved, the man who had discarded her when she was at her most vulnerable. She saw the cowardice in his eyes, the same cowardice that had allowed him to believe a lie because it was easier than being a man. "We were never family, Marcus," Grace said, her voice clear and cold. "Family is a sanctuary. You were just a prison I didn't know I was in. Minho is right. You should leave. You're trespassing on a life you're no longer a part of." Marcus turned and fled, stumbling over his own feet as the security team trailed him to the gate. He didn't look back. He knew he was beaten, not just by money, but by a man who understood a brand of loyalty Marcus couldn't even imagine. Minho turned back to Grace, the lethal edge vanishing from his expression, replaced by a quiet, protective warmth. He walked over and gently placed his hand over hers on her stomach. "He won't bother you again," Minho promised. "The trap is closed. He will be too busy trying to keep his own head above water to ever look at yours again." Grace leaned her head against Minho's shoulder, the final weight of her past lifting like mist in the sun. "You really don't play by the rules, do you?" "Only the rules that matter, Grace," Minho whispered, kissing her forehead. "And the first rule is that what is mine is never touched, and you and Michael, are mine." As they walked back toward the mansion, Grace knew the extortion was over. The false claim had been answered with a final, crushing truth. She wasn't a victim to be bartered. She was a woman who had found her king. And for Marcus Johnson, the midnight he had forced upon Grace was finally beginning for him, and this time there would be no one to hear him scream. The legal machinery of Minho Lee moved with the same silent, crushing inevitability as the man himself. In the weeks following the confrontation at the estate, Marcus Johnson's world didn't just crumble, it vanished. The friends, who had whispered poison into his ear, were the first to turn, offering testimony against him in exchange for leniency when the local precinct raided the basement Marcus had foolishly allowed them to use. By the time the final court date arrived, Marcus was a shell of a man, stripped of his home, his reputation, and his freedom. Grace watched the final proceedings from a secure video link in the Lee mansion, her hand resting on a belly that was now low and heavy, the time of Michael's arrival drawing near. She watched as Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief as the judge read out the sentence for his involvement in the illicit activities and the documented domestic abuse of his pregnant wife. There was no joy in her heart as the heavy doors closed behind him, only a profound, quiet relief. The storm that had started at midnight was finally over, and the man who had tried to drown her was now submerged in a sea of his own making. 3 days later, the quiet of the Lee estate was broken by the sharp, urgent cry of a newborn. The birth took place in the mansion's private medical wing, under the watchful eyes of the same elite team that had nursed Grace back to health. Minho did not pace the hallways like a stranger. He stood by the door, his presence a silent anchor in the room as Grace navigated the final, grueling hours of labor. When the doctor finally held up a beautiful, dark-skinned boy with a head of thick, curly hair, the atmosphere in the room shifted from clinical intensity to a hallowed, breathless awe. "He's here, Grace," Minho whispered, stepping to her side. His voice, usually so cold and commanding, was thick with an emotion he had spent a lifetime suppressing. Mrs. Han cleaned the infant and wrapped him in a blanket of the finest white cashmere before placing him into Grace's trembling arms. Grace looked down at her son, at Michael, and felt a love so fierce it physically ached. He was perfect. He was the survivor of the construction site, the leftover feasts, and the midnight rain. "Look at him, Minho," Grace breathed, her eyes brimming with tears of pure, unadulterated triumph. "He's whole. He's safe." Minho reached out, his large, calloused hand looking gargantuan against the infant's tiny form. He hesitated for a heartbeat, a man who had handled weapons and led empires unsure of how to touch something so fragile. Then, with a tenderness that brought a fresh wave of tears to Grace's eyes, he brushed his thumb against Michael's cheek. "May I?" Minho asked. Grace nodded, sliding the bundle into his arms. As Minho Lee held the child, the transformation was complete. The Mafia boss, a man who had once believed that his perfect life was defined by the fear he inspired and the wealth he accumulated, realized he had been living in a desert. He looked down at the boy, a child who was not of his blood but was now entirely of his heart, and felt the hole in his own life close forever. He wasn't just a protector anymore, he was a father. He wasn't just a billionaire. He was a guardian of a future that didn't involve shadows or violence. "He will never know the cold, Michael," Minho whispered to the sleeping infant, his dark eyes shining with a vow that was more binding than any contract. "He will never know the hunger, and he will never, ever be told he is a mistake." Minho looked up at Grace, his expression one of absolute devotion. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then sat on the edge of the bed, the three of them forming a silhouette against the rising sun outside the window. The city below was waking up, unaware that its most feared man had been tamed by a tiny heartbeat. Marcus Johnson was behind bars. Chloe was a distant memory in a foreign land. and the false claim had been buried under the weight of a new, undeniable truth. Grace Johnson had walked out of a storm at midnight with nothing, only to find that the very end of her world was the beginning of a kingdom. In the quiet of the morning, surrounded by the warmth of a home built on protection and the soft sounds of a breathing child, the Mafia boss and the woman from the shadows finally found their peace. The life that Min-ho Lee had once thought was perfect had been a lie. The one he held in his arms now was the only one worth living. Grace went from a concrete floor to a Mafia mansion because she never stopped fighting for her child. If you believe every mother deserves a protector like Min-ho, hit that like button and subscribe to join our family. If you were Min-ho, would you have divorced your wife on the spot like that? Tell us your thoughts below. And if you're watching from New York, South Africa, or anywhere else, shout out your city in the comments. Remember, the darkest midnight always leads to the brightest dawn. Sleep well and stay strong.